Hey, Rob, great to see you today. Thanks so much for
Likewise.
joining us. Today we've got Rob Bullough. He is the Director of Global Marketing at EA, right? Not EA
Yeah, well,
Sports.
we kind of actually, my role sort of sits in between games label and sports label. So
Oh,
actually
okay.
now for the first time in my career at EA, I can say, yeah, kind of sports too. So yeah.
And I'm a huge EA fan. We talked about that, so I'm super excited. Been a big fan for a while, since the PlayStation 2 days, as we talked about. That was a fun conversation. But again, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. Really quick, I just want to give a little shout out to AdMix and what we do. We are AdMix is the gateway for brands to enter the metaverse. I know it's what everyone wants to know. What does that even mean? We have a very simple approach that we currently own over 100 properties in various meta worlds. But really importantly is that what that does is helps mitigate risk for brands of having to think about how they're going to convert to cryptocurrency to buy land, should they buy land, or even how do they pay for an activation along those lines. So we mitigate all that risk by taking that risk away. We own the land, and then we can actually bill and transact on an IO basis. But at the end of the day, it's about helping brands navigate the landscape of where the right fit for their brand should be located, building out the structure, and then assisting within activating the community. So really excited, though, to be here with Rob. Like I said, we had a great conversation earlier, and Rob's got a great background and obviously a great job, because who wouldn't want to work at EA? But, Rob, we talked about your non-traditional marketing background, and I love how you described that aha moment when the internet clicked for you. Can you share with everyone a little bit more about that moment and kind of how you, and what that meant for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the thing that I've always followed throughout my entire career, since leaving school, was just something which excited me, was passionate. When I ultimately felt a little bit out of my depth, it was like, oh, okay, this is probably kind of exciting. This should be something. There's something to learn here. And at the time when the internet was started to become a platform which was available to, I don't know, folks like myself who, weren't hardcore technical, but had like a technical lean, then I was at the time throwing parties with a bunch of friends in London in various different warehouses. And we had to learn how to promote these parties. And so it began with flyers, and then it's like, wow, the internet, sure, maybe we should make a website. Yeah, let's do that. Let's make a website. And it just kind of, that was the beauty of that time, right? It was just, you could just do it. And it didn't really mean anything. Nobody really knew what a website was, what it was supposed to deliver, or even would anybody find the thing. And so it's the moment I started to build it, I was like, oh, wow, yeah, this is something else. This is something I want to be a part of. I want to get deeper into this. This is where I go next. And I was hooked from that moment. Like, it was, I don't know, like, it was novel, the idea that you could publish something onto this place and then other people could see it all over the world. It sounds kind of corny and dumb now, but I remember the time, like I said to you earlier, it almost has like I can still feel it, I can still smell it and taste the energy of that at that moment. It was fantastic, like really cool.
Yeah, no, that's so great. I've been around the space, since that long, and I really feel like we're at that same moment now with the metaverse. So it's super exciting, and I know we talked about that, but it's like, it's not that often that we have those opportunities in our careers to be able to participate in something like this. So that's fantastic.
Completely.
Right?
That kind of Wild West mentality that
exactly
anything can happen here. Nobody's really in charge. Nobody's making the rules. It's so good. Yeah,
absolutely. And then given your background, when did you begin your career in marketing? Like, and what have you found to be your biggest challenges you had to overcome given that non-traditional background?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the largely my career in marketing pretty much began the moment I actually left and started to throw these parties in warehouses, because ultimately I needed to figure out a way to tell people that these things existed, and also to figure out what it was that they would want even from an event. So actually I didn't even know I was doing marketing at the time, but ultimately that's more or less where it began. And so I suppose as my career has developed and I've chased after different dreams and different ways of delivering my craft, I guess when I eventually decided to call myself a marketer, I suppose there was definitely kind of an imposter syndrome situation there and a massive lingo deficiency. Whilst I think in my bones I knew there was a system for speaking to people, you know, like I just didn't know what it was called. And so I didn't have any of the right words, but I just had a feeling of like, no, I need to understand what it is which makes folks tick and, you know, investigate that and, you know, prod at it and try and figure out more about it. And then, I don't know, match that to some kind of experience or product or something which could exist in the world, and then figure out a way to tell them about it. And the telling them about it part, that's the part which has taken a lot more learning. I think that's the thing which was always a bit of a it was always hard for me throughout my career to figure that out. So it's only latterly that I've been able to actually develop some chops in the kind of downstream end of the kind of marketing experience.
Right, and we talked about that, and you know, I really love the way you describe marketing as being an end-to-end sort of linear. I don't know if I'd say linear, but sort of an end-to-end sort of process. And you know, as in you just mentioned upstream and downstream, with brand marketing being upstream and product marketing being downstream. And I loved your description of it, and I was hoping you might be able to elaborate a little bit more about how you view this approach.
Yeah, sure. Like, I think that it's in the kind of brand management end, so way upstream. It's ultimately kind of long incubation time, right? Not necessarily, you know, like procrastination, but just incubating on ideas. You know, like looking for signals in the world, things which, whether you're coming, you know, top down or bottom up, like trying to figure out what it is that might excite an audience around any particular thing, whatever it is, happens to be our kind of our portfolio approach. So you get this kind of slow burn, long incubation, kind of potentially building these long-term plans for expensive decisions, which will live in the market for a very, very, very long time. And that stuff it's really exciting, you know, but it only gets rewarding once we kind of enter then the next stage, which is ultimately turning that signal, which we package into various strategies for growth or acquisition or whatever it is that we're looking for, and then start to work with the product teams in order to build that into something which resembles a product, which matches the insights which we've kind of figured out upstream. And then the kind of the latter, the kind of downstream part, where we've switched from long incubation to short to zero incubation time. Decisions need to be made in, you know, seconds as opposed to, you know, weeks and months that we kind of grown accustomed to at the other end. And ultimately now we're looking at expensive tactics as opposed to expensive decisions. And, you know, that is a really and so the order of business and the rhythm of business and the velocity of everything we do changes dramatically. But it's when that comes alive, that full end-to-end experience, and we can see it from one end to the other. Oh my gosh, like that's the dream. It's too good. It's
right.
That's what keeps me locked in this job.
Of course.
When that comes alive, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Well, because you've seen it, you've taken it from that ideation, that whole brand marketing perspective. And then, you know, I think, and then as you mentioned, it's like a slow moving train that just keeps getting faster and faster until, you know, you're actually going to execute on all these things that you've been planning. And that's where that, you know, that it's like you're exercising muscles that you don't use at the beginning end of the process. And then you get to the end and you're like, okay, we got to go.
Right.
We got to get this out the door.
It's kind of fun too. Like I remember once upon a time in a previous lifetime, I dabbled with programming, and I remember there was when you're building these systems where you didn't see a single thing appear on screen for years. Well, not years. Maybe it's like exaggeration, but for a very long time.
Maybe that's why you're not in programming.
Lost my job pretty quick. But like building that kind of underlying system, and then you know, which takes a while, and then suddenly things start to appear on screen, and everything that you did in that first foundational kind of layering now is like paying off. It's like, oh gosh, right now we can go and build massive pressure in this channel because of all that work that we did in the run-up. So
no, that's it. And I love that description. I've never really heard it that way from a marketing perspective, and I thought that was really just unique and a different view. And you know, I also thought, you know, one of the other things that we talked coming out of that, right, is how you view digital innovation and digital tech to help you gain greater insights into consumer behavior, but even dug a little deeper beyond just consumer behavior. And would love if you could share with everyone about really how you're approaching that, because I thought it was really, really insightful.
Yeah, I think that I've always been a little bit, well, actually, I've always been a little bit suspicious, let's put it that way, of qualitative research. And I have to be completely honest, largely down to the fact that I have participated in qualitative research when, a poor student couldn't afford a can of beans. And so, and would invent characters, when I used to go to these sessions and kind of pretend that I believed certain things that I didn't believe. And I can only assume people still do that. And so I kind of have this inherent distrust of, you ask somebody, what do they think? They're probably not going to tell you the reason why. And I suppose my rationale behind that has become a little bit more sophisticated in recent years, because it's largely just, it's obvious, right? And I still do it today. People ask me a question and I'll tell them an answer that I think they want to hear, as opposed to actually what I think. And so, but what I do and what I think is something which we can now observe. And so that ability to truly study the behaviors of what motivates the people who may well be engaging with our marketing and our product is something which, that's where I'd see digital innovation being something which can really, really pay off for myself and the business that I'm involved in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's great. And, we talked a little bit about challenges that are inherent with that sort of approach from a consumer behavior standpoint that, you've experienced with it. So can you talk a little bit about what those challenges have been?
Yeah, well, I think it's bias, right? That's the thing that's the problem that we have, is that and so I think that ultimately what I'm interested in trying to figure out, and it gets creepy fast. So like there's a point where we have to kind of, well, okay, we don't need that much information, but I'm interested in understanding, what do people really want and what do they really, really think about a certain topic. And that's where it stops being creepy. It's like, no, just this bit, the rest of it, not interested. And ultimately figuring out what is the thing which sits underneath the obvious. So what's the part which they're not saying, the subtext, the bit which we don't know about. And that comes down to, smart interrogation of the data, right? And matching that with hypotheses and smart data scientists who can help us pass this stuff so that it actually starts to tell stories, as opposed to confirming biases. Because I find that in myself, I do the same thing, like I have an idea and hypothesis. I think, oh, I know, I'll go and reach into the data to prove myself right. And then I come up with like, yeah, I knew I was right. Look at this massive number. That shows that I'm right. And I suppose that what I'm interested in is not just uncovering what sits underneath what people say about their preferences, but equally turning that same lamp on ourselves as marketers and saying, okay, well, where do our biases live as well? What do we think, just because, I mean, this is a very blunt piece of data, but just because a campaign worked with a particular audience in 2016 doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work again in 2020. And so it's like I say, blunt. That's not even like rich data. That's really blunt data, but it's incredible how many times we make that mistake and just assume it's like, yeah, cool, it's the same people, we'll pick them up. And so, continuing that sort of evergreen cycle of, the upstream research delivering, fantastically new, like right now, insights that we can then action in product and then in latterly in communications, is keeping that alive is crazy important for it to solve our own biases and the lazy blunt biases, such as do the same thing we did 3 years ago.
Yeah, no. And I think, listen, we're in a space that just is moving and innovating so quickly that it's really, you just can't rely on what worked before. But I love the fact that, you're really trying to dig under the surface of what somebody tells you. But I think that really comes back to your personal experience, right? Because you created these characters for it. And you're like, well, wait a minute. If I did that, I'm sure I'm not that unique in the world that, some of these other people might be doing it. And so how do I get below that to really understand what motivates them, from that, for making those decisions? And it's, as we talked about, it's like, you've got to get out of the conscious and into the subconscious, but in a subtle way, so that people are, sort of revealing themselves in an honest and, authentic way, as opposed to, kind of to your point, like, telling them, well, I'm going to tell them what they want to hear. They want to hear their product's great. Oh, I really love this feature and that feature, but it isn't what I believe in, because it's not what I've really experienced along those lines. So
Fully.
It's a very nuanced sort of approach that you've got to take to it.
It truly is. I mean, we've seen it in some of our games, where we know that there's some of our games will require a story for people to engage with them, for instance, right? So
I've enjoyed a lot of those stories, by the way.
Yeah, well, me too, right? And the thing is sometimes those stories, and so we tell ourselves, okay, cool, we need a story. And sometimes we can take that data point and use it really badly. In the case that we think, okay, cool, let's go and hire a ton of really banging story writers to create some really exceptional monolithic story that really gets under the meat of these players who are looking for a rich dynamic story. And we may well spend a ton of time investing in those people, and then we will use that same crusty insight to then go and tell people, hey, come and play this amazing game because it's got this really rich story. And then we're scratching our heads at the end going, wait a minute, why does everyone hate this game? This is really weird. And we've done this, right? And so but actually what they wanted was they wanted to tell their own stories inside the video game. That's actually the thing they wanted to do. So they wanted to have the story act as cues to give them moments to react to, like a context to kind of push back against the decisions they're making, but ultimately feel like they're telling their own story inside the game. And so it's funny, yeah, because it's the same.
No, go ahead.
No. It's just it comes from the same place. It sounds almost like the same thing, but actually the action you take off the back of that insight is nuanced, and just looked at it from a slightly different angle can result in massive success or really depressing failure to the point where everyone's going, oh man, we spent 3 years building that. Why does everyone hate it so much? So yeah. Do
you bring consumers in to get feedback and focus groups along the way to kind of understand even further? And I know this isn't anything we talked about, but I'm just curious because I'm a gamer. I've enjoyed many an EA game, and I thought that what you just said was really interesting, is because those storytelling games, right? You're going through a process, but the game changes based on the decisions that I make, but to a certain extent, right? And it's not like the open world games where everybody, I can't play the open world games, by the way. I'm really bad at it. I just don't react that quickly. I'm much more into the stories.
Sure.
But on one hand, it's frustrating in the stories because I know that there's always, there's always some path that you can take, but it really, depending on what path you take will determine your success of the game. And so you'll try different strategies because there's not just one set way to do it. And so I never really thought about it until you put it in that perspective that now it's my decisions on me outsmarting the gunner or whoever's shooting because I'm going this way versus that way. And I went this way 5 times and I got killed. Right. And so now I'm going to go the other way. And so I think that's really brilliant. It's an interesting perspective to invite the consumer or the user into that game experience based on how they're playing the game.
Yeah, it's a very different way of approaching the same problem or an insight that appears to be one-dimensional. It's actually not, right? It's multi-dimensional and nuanced and actually it led us up to something which is actually really what's the word? It's a really good bedfellow with exciting marketing in the sense that it's about fantasy, right? It's about if we can create if we can understand what fantasy that our player might want, or in another kind of marketing vertical, what is the fantasy which this person might buy into, or they would excite them in order to bring that into their lives. Then following through with that, through the entire stream is the important part, rather than wrestling that fantasy into this kind of singular experience, which is no longer the fantasy. It's just more like a frustrating experience where the game just keeps telling you, oh, by the way, you should be sad now. Okay, cool. I'll try being sad, but I'm actually not. I'm just annoyed you're making me watch this film.
No, man, I think that is that it's just such an interesting part of and then of the process, right? Because then that also gives you, like you talked about the upstream and the downstream, is that gives you more from a brand marketing perspective of, I would imagine, to weave into that story when the actual if the campaign comes out, because you're leveraging those sort of that storyline or that that exciting aspect of the game into your marketing somehow, because you've got to communicate that to consumers. Like, you've got to make sure that's coming through in your marketing as well.
Indeed, and I suppose that's where the investing the time, understanding what it is that we're trying to say, what it is we're trying to be as a brand, up top, so that then ultimately, what I refer to as like building the signal. Like, what is that signal? Bruce Mao had this fantastic phrase that he used once when I was listening to him talk. Pure signal was a thing that he wanted to put into all of his work to ensure that everyone, when they saw it, they're like, oh my gosh, I want to work with this guy, right? Because it just reeked of Bruce Mao. I thought it was like, yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, pure signal. I love that. And that's our job in the upstream, is to figure out what is the purest signal we have, and so that then we can then use that like further down the line. But importantly, don't be lazy with that insight, because it's very easy to project what we think that means. But actually, if we haven't done sufficient work to figure out actually where that pokes at somebody's motivation for wanting to get involved, then we're going to fail, because we could be showing them. So for instance, taking the storyline example from before, we could just show them too much story and they're going to think, oh my gosh, this is a movie, with some interaction in it. I'm not interested in that. As opposed to, this is a fantasy where I'm going to go on this adventure and things are going to react and I'm going to feel amazing, and I'm going to be in control of stuff and status and all those other things that may well motivate the player. It's getting those signals into the marketing as we flow downstream.
No, it's absolutely, there's a real natural symbiosis to it, right? So one of the things that we talked on and touched on a little earlier, and I want to get back to, is you identified that there's inherent bias in both the consumers, but also your own marketing team. And how do you manage that, right? Like, how do you try and manage it from a consumer's perspective, but also from your own marketing team?
Yeah, it's a oh gosh, it's a funny one, because I'm guilty of it too. Even though I'm sitting here talking to you and saying and evangelizing about how we should be more objective and we should eradicate our biases, I'll find myself doing it. I'm like, oh, Rob, what are you doing? Again, like, I'll send an email and realize it's just riddled with bias. I'll have a hypothesis riddled with bias. I'll go and prove it. And so what I've tried to get into the habit of is to start to use data in order to prove myself wrong, as opposed to prove myself right. And so even the simplest stuff, like I say, the things that are tactic that we may have used once before for an audience, which we think is the same, always challenging it, giving something a moment to be challenged, I think, is the most important thing that we can do. Rather than continually searching for ways to prove ourselves right, we should be looking for more ways to prove ourselves wrong. Now, I think that the problem with that is that it can lead to procrastination, and obviously that's the enemy. Once we're in when we're trying to get things done, bring things to market, we just need to be making fast decisions. And so all of that procrastination, internalization, looking at the work, poking at it, prodding it, that belongs upstream. And because we don't have time to do it then we just have to lean into our biases and just be done with it. But yeah, I think a lot that can be gained from trying to prove yourself wrong with data. And it's funny because it sounds kind of dumb, like saying it. It's like, yeah, obviously, but the first time I did it, it was really hard because I wasn't used to doing it, and so it took a minute to actually get used to it, because I was like, well, I don't even know where to look for this data. What query do I ask? Because the question, as any research will tell you, the question is the key, right? If you're getting the question right, and any data science will probably tell you the same thing. If you don't ask the data the right question, then you're not going to get an answer which is anything remotely useful. And so yeah, I didn't have the vocabulary to ask the data questions or the person questions or any of that in order to prove myself wrong. So yeah, like understanding bias. There's tons of great reading, on bias as a thing, which I think is worth all of us indulging in, because it's not just on this particular topic, right? It's amazing what the amount of bias infects our daily, to and fro our work, and how much it holds us back, as a collective in doing great work. So
But not only that, it seeps into, you know, everybody's daily life, but depending on what they're doing for a career, it seeps into their work, which then eventually has a greater effect than they probably knew. And it, you know, so many times bias is unconscious, right? We don't realize that we're doing it. We don't think of ourselves as biased yet. It comes out in other ways that you don't think of. And, you know, I'm curious because you just touched upon it with, you know, proving yourself wrong. And I know we've just got a few minutes to wrap up here, but, you know, from that perspective, how, you know, what is it that started you on that journey? Was there something you read? Was there, you know, somebody that influenced you that you came across that shared that same view? What like kind of brought you to be like, hey, I'm tired, you know, I can't prove myself right all the time. Like, let's dig in a little deeper and figure out, let's prove ourselves wrong.
I think I don't think I necessarily, I don't remember the exact situation, but I can tell you the context of it, or the kind of the broad strokes. In that I guess I'm a natural optimist, right? I want things to be great, and so I'm very quickly excited, and I'm very quickly disappointed. You know, it's kind of a bit of a roller coaster, and so, and equally kind of cynical, but also really, you know, the opposite of whatever the opposite of cynical is. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that whenever anything happens, I guess there's always a little voice in the back of my head saying, wait a minute, like, I'm not entirely sure about that. And so naturally, when we look at sometimes, I think if I recall correctly, I saw somebody presenting something, and it was abundantly clear to me that they were just all the data points they pulled. It's like, this is clearly just nonsense. There has to be another side to this coin. Like this is too good to be true. There's no way this is real. And then maybe like 2 or 3 days later, I was preparing a report for, you know, some kind of review internally, and I found myself doing exactly the same thing. I was like, okay, God, I need a number that can do that. I need a number that can prove that. I need to show success over here. Let's find a number that shows success. And that was the moment. I was like, oh, okay, right.
You're
that
like,
guy
yeah,
right now.
you're that exactly. Because you can prove anything you want to, right? You can always justify it or provide some support to it, but taking that deeper look, like, how do I prove myself wrong? Is this really the right information I want to be able to present? So, well, listen, I know we're up at time. Rob, it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for sharing so much of your background and your thought process. And, you know, you bring such a different approach to it. I really, really appreciated that. So.
Likewise, mate. Yeah, thanks a lot for your time. It's been
absolutely
fun. Thanks.
All right. Fantastic, Rob. Thanks so much.
Cheers. Bye.